So for the Q&A, we have a first respondent. This is Dr. Arely Cruz Santiago. She's a Leverhulme Trust Early Career Fellow within the Sociology, Philosophy and Anthropology Department at the University of Exeter. In 2014, she was one of the founders of Citizen-led Forensics, the first forensics DNA database created, managed, and governed by relatives of disappeared persons in Mexico. And the project, funded by the UK's Economic and Social Research Council, Transformative Research Stream, is a product of a long-standing ethnographic engagement that has explored how families of disappeared persons become forensic experts in their own right. Cruz Santiago's Leverhulme Fellowship, Forensic Citizenship, Science and Expertise in Latin America, examines the development of forensic grassroots practices and governance that have emerged in Latin America amid human rights violations. Her research has analyzed citizen-led forensic practices such as case file analysis, DNA, mapping, GPS, and the use of drones to aid in the search for the disappeared. Her research challenges existing forensic investigation models. She holds a master's in Criminology and Criminal Justice and a PhD in Human Geography from Durham University, UK. So Aurelie, you have like 5 to 10 minutes to give a first response to the 3 projects that we have seen so far, and then later on we open up the floor for questions and answers from the participants. So your time, Aurelie.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for the invitation, Irving. It's been fascinating just hearing about all these different projects, and I guess I now have the sort of a difficult task to sort of bring them all together and sort of pinpoint to some areas that I think are interesting and that deserve further discussion. So I think what we have seen is like I've seen like the 3 different points that sort of emerged from these presentations. We have been talking about the importance of collecting data, of doing this with local communities. We saw these examples of the importance of collecting environmental data, forensic data, either in the sense of and for disappearances and what is going on in Mexico. But at the same time, we have heard about the importance of collecting data for accountability and looking at human rights violations in other parts of the world. And I would like about these 3 different all the different presentations was how everyone talked about time and how time is important to engage with the communities, to co-design the technologies, to employ participatory methodologies to not only develop the research project, but also the categories that will be involved in this whole process. And I will sort of, think about also the importance of local communities as the ones who are not only collecting data, but also being the custodians of it. I believe it was at the very beginning of Justin's presentation. He talked about how local schools act as custodians of the technologies, of access to, through schools and through local communities, they have access to light, water, and everything they need to set up these endeavors and to make all these data that they have collected actionable, which I think that's the important part of it all. It's not only about collecting and designing the technologies with the communities, but also of making all this information actionable for the same communities and for the benefit. So I would say that another thing and theme that I saw through all the presentations was about visibility. So what do we make visible and how? We heard about storytelling and the sort of the force that storytelling and creating new narratives entails, but also about the importance of maps and images, right? So I think that was really, really interesting that we can see all that through the different presentations. And I think it's great, everything that we have seen, and I would like just to push a little bit further and we talk about the importance of not replicating colonialism and colonial practices of extractivism. But so far, the sort of the examples we have seen are based in Africa or faraway places, which apparently have not been touched by technology. So I would like to sort of think about different ways we can engage with this type of projects which are not necessarily in spaces that are well known for being spaces where colonial practices have developed. I would like also to think about what other governance mechanisms we can create to manage and collect the data. Because so far what we hear is sort of communities collecting data, co-designing the technologies, but then, and something I would like to ask about this project is how are we creating, or how are they creating new governance mechanisms for this data? Who has access? Like communities collect it, scientists and researchers analyze it, and then what happens to that data? Is it actionable for whom? For the communities, for the researchers, for who is this data being made actionable for? And again, just to finalize, another idea would be to think about visibility. So what do we gain from invisibility? So I guess we always talk about openness and importance of make spaces visible and atrocities make them visible, but it will be interesting also to think about when invisibility is important, because that could help the local communities. And finally, just thinking through all these projects makes me sort of think about also how we not only go into these places and bring technologies and co-designing with them, but also how local communities are have knowledge in their own right, are experts in the area. So how do we use these local, well, not use, how do we sort of make sense of the local knowledge and implemented it into the technologies we are designing? Those are a couple of points that I sort of was able to write down and think through while people were presenting. So I hope this sort of offers a little bit of provocations for the Q&A and the discussions.
Definitely. So I don't know, I mean, if Fabienne or Hannah or Justin want to go first with some of the responses to what Aurelie has said so far with these provocations, interesting provocations.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so those are some really interesting ideas, and I think a lot, I'm sure, of what everyone else would want to say ties a lot of those things together, particularly in when we're, for us, designing our projects. A lot of the stuff that we think about when we try and talk about how, for example, local knowledge is implemented in design comes back to the kind of co-design processes that we use. We showed you some of the categories that we produce with people, but a lot of it also ties into this idea about how we can engage with projects in places which are not sort of post-colonial locations, and whether really something is anti-colonial if you're just undertaking it in a post-colonial location. So some of the research that we do really does directly impact Indigenous communities, but a lot of what we're looking at really is about how people with any kind of limited literacy can engage with recording things that matter to them. So we do try and work with our projects in the UK, for example. We've worked with trying to record things like knife crime with people. So for us, it's something which we think about being implicitly anti-colonial because it challenges particularly citizen science. I think Fabienne might show you a diagram in a minute. Particularly citizen science, which engages people who are non-professional in being able to produce this. But we go beyond this idea of it being inclusive by making the argument that it can be anti-colonial because it responds to community need.
Can you see the?
Can you see the slide that the image that we're showing you now? Do you want to talk it through?
Yeah, so here basically, yeah, we have this classic science that we for example, me and Anna are part of this group on the top, and what citizen science is trying to achieve usually is to use citizens as sensors. So basically, people will just collect data that will be used by scientists. So they are just like free labor or used as free labor. And with extreme citizen science, this concept, we have tried to push the boundary of citizen science towards, you know, this group of non-literate people, and when they can go not only they can just not only do data collection, but also, you know, start from the problem definition, and they will choose which they want to collect, they will analyze them, and eventually at the end taking action. So this is how I can answer to one of your main questions. There was many of them. So.
And yeah, it sort of tries to, I think, engage with lots of the things you talk about, particularly as well also when you're talking about data governance and how it's actionable. I'm sure that, Justin, you might have found your link by now, so you might want to jump in too, but it was great to be able to try and engage with those ideas briefly. Thanks.
I'm still fumbling around to find it, and so I'll drop it into the chat in a couple of minutes. But I think I was going to say very much the same as you. It's the key here, I think, is ensuring that the communities that you're supposed to be working for or with are included right from the design phase. Because what happens very often in any of this kind of research is that the research design, the parameters and the framing often happens very far away. And then we work inclusively with communities, but they're working within a box that we've created for them. So it's very important that right from the beginning, going in with almost no preconceptions and figuring out, what is it that gives you nightmares at night? What keeps you awake? And have those answers to help understand what the community's real kind of priority is and what we should be using these tools and technologies and their time. Time is expensive, even if these are communities that aren't in informal kind of economies. We need to make sure that we're investing the attention, the time and the goodwill on stuff that really matters to these communities and not mapping what we think is important or kind of collecting data around it. And it goes both ways. I mean, the link I was trying to look for is through our African drone project. We took a bunch of African drone pilots to the US to model kind of urban inequality in US cities and to tell that story, which is just a reverse of the usual power dynamic. So we also need to use these kind of technologies, not just to give agency and data about people's own lived reality, but to help them understand and kind of articulate their views on the North itself, because they're then able to take those insights back home with them and understand that, maybe the economic models that are being kind of suggested are not necessarily an answer. There's still poverty pockets. There's still kind of accommodation issues, even in the richest of US cities. I will find that link. It led to a very, very good kind of interactive series published by The Guardian America, just as an example of how that can actually play out in a non-patronizing way, giving people real voice, speaking as equals, because I think that's my final point, is that this should be done in a way that is empowering, so that people speak as peers to kind of, the data should be empowering rather than disempowering, and people shouldn't feel patronized in the process. Back to you, Evan.
Justin, now, by the way, which you're now speaking, you've got a question, and sorry if I don't mention the names of the participants, but since we're recording, we're not mentioning the names of the attendees. But you have a very interesting question here for Justin. It seems that you define citizen engagement in 2 dimensions: the front end, production orientation engagement, and back end, reception oriented engagement. What are your challenges in each of these dimensions? You have a series of questions, actually. How do you deal with issues related to audience hesitancy, privacy concerns, to engage with your projects, and also issues related to data quality, reliability?
So that's a whole bunch of questions. I'll try and work through them. I think it's very important, this kind of, firstly, you need to be involved in the design and the framing and the production of that data, the creation of the data. But also it needs to be designed for the community that you're extracting the data out of. Way too often we speak about communities using data or journalism or whatever it is, and it's designed for an external audience. Even if that external audience is still in a country, we're speaking about power elites or people, those with kind of access to kind of the means to control people's realities. So we try very much to always ensure that firstly it gives articulation or agency locally within that community. It's not easy. You're going with preconceptions, and sometimes there is no feasible practical way to do it, but you need to make the effort. So I think that's the one piece. I think you need to understand that kind of data is a long tail artifact, but becomes obsolete very quickly. And so part of keeping the agency alive is ensuring that there's a sense of ownership or custodianship, but that people understand that that data evolves over time and that they're responsible as a community, like with other community resources, for shaping and guiding the evolution of that data asset. So I think that's the one thing. The challenges, technologies and the usual bridging kind of analog and digital. It's not as difficult as people assume it is. In fact, small amounts of data can often have exponentially larger impacts in data poor communities, like disinformation or misinformation does for that matter. Just because there's less clutter, there's less kind of distraction. So it's more meaningful. In terms of hesitancy, the hesitancy we've encountered, and maybe it's just because of the kinds of projects we've engaged in, hasn't really been around privacy, although it should be. We've been the ones bringing up the privacy issue. It's more been around ownership and kind of what that data might be used for once it leaves the control of the community. So now, what does a government agency do with the data in terms of planning? Can they use it against us? Can they suddenly, if we've identified all of our schools that are not registered, could those schools be closed down, for example, rather than the traditional PII kind of approach of, personal identifiable kind of information. So I think often there's a piece of kind of literacy that needs to go alongside some of this research and data work. We definitely don't have the answers. I think that we've benefited from working with large multinational organizations like a World Bank, who obviously think about this from a risk kind of point of view, but also with very, very many kind of frontline human rights organizations who take a far more kind of proactive stance on these issues.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Justin. Okay, we have a question or an intervention from Roxana, I believe. Roxana, our participant.
Sí.
Speaker.
Gracias. Solo comentar al respecto de lo que mencionó Arely. La documentación sin duda es una herramienta sumamente valiosa y que empodera a todas las comunidades y a las personas también que logran esta colección de datos. Y precisamente por eso debe ser muy cuidada, porque permite impulsar un cambio. Y ese cambio, bien, todos buscamos que sea en beneficio de las áreas más afectadas de la sociedad, pero es necesario a través de esto buscar que siempre conserven esta voz, o sea, darle la voz a los actores principales y con ello abrirles un camino de diálogo, nuestro parecer, con las autoridades que son las que tienen esta posibilidad de generar estos cambios, hablando de en dónde quedan los datos para generar mecanismos de gobernanza, ¿no? Entonces, estos cambios bien pueden ser posibles, pero sí se requiere como abrir este camino de diálogo precisamente a través de lo que el resto de los expertos conocemos, ¿no? Como expertos nos acercamos a los diferentes grupos, proporcionamos herramientas y también es nuestro deber a través de esta intervención cuidar que no sean, que esta documentación, que esta información que de manera tan valiosa ellos han construido y que de manera tan valiosa les pertenece, no sean manipulados por grupos de poder que buscan otras intenciones o que incluso mismas autoridades, mismo Estado, puede utilizarla nuevamente en contra, que es algo que nos ha enseñado también la historia. Solamente resaltar el valor de la documentación y el valor de mantener la voz en quienes poseen esta información.
Thank you very much, Roxana. I believe the connection between organizations and just the general public, along with authorities, is something that might be very important for forensic analysis, for legal purposes, right? In cases of enforced disappearance, have to just go to tribunals, for instance. So that's a very interesting point. But Arely, I don't know if you would like to jump into that a little bit and probably kind of unpack it a little bit more, because you are kind of very familiarized with those kind of debates.
Yeah, sure. But I had a question. If there is for the panelists,
Sure.
if I'm allowed to, I was thinking about openness, and I love how Justin mentioned about something about steal, right? Steal our ideas, use our technology, and I love that part, right? Because that's I would say that when I talk about governance mechanisms, that's part of the things that I think are interesting and important to sort of talk about. How do we make all these technologies and all these projects and things we are developing, co-developing with the local communities available for others, not only in the particular community that we are working with, but also everywhere in the world. So yeah, still our ideas. And I was wondering if the team Excite team, if I'm allowed to say that, Excite team, have also, like, your technologies are also open for everyone to use, like your code, and so I don't know if you want to sort of expand maybe a little bit of that, and maybe Justin, if you have seen your technologies being stolen and used for so that would be great to hear about, to discuss governance and the importance of not only putting local communities on the table, but also dismantling the table. It's not, if that makes sense.
Thanks, that's a great question, and I think it's really important for us to say what we've produced is 3 different apps, which they run on the Android platform. They're available for free. One of them is desktop based, and 2 of them are mobile device applications. They're available for free, you can download them, and we also have a large community of people who are able to engage with looking at the code and looking at the parts of things that are run that produce it. We've intentionally designed things for them to be openly accessible, not only because it's useful and we care about being able to share these kind of resources, because as obviously we're from an academic institution, a lot of what we can provide to people are resources, but also it's really valuable to have feedback from people day to day as to how things work and how they are usable and how they're not usable and how they function, how they could function better for people. One of the things that we do, Fabian mentioned, we have the stages when we're doing the research, is about data ownership. So we recognize our responsibility to tell people who might not have, as Justin mentioned, the kind of understandings of where data can go and how it can be transferred and where it can change and how it can move. We are responsible for describing to people who might engage with producing data the things that might happen afterwards. But our bottom line is always that the people who produce the data continue to own the data. So we will continue to be responsible to helping support people manage this data, but they always can own it and make the decisions about it. And we try and help them understand how they make those decisions.
Yeah, so I mean, it's software, it's data, it's kind of the documentation that often goes into a lot of this research. And then also I'm going to drop in a couple of other resources, including one that sadly and embarrassingly we haven't been maintaining properly because we're busy rebuilding. But it's also the patterns or the recipes that you use when you work on many of these projects. What are the approaches? What are the kind of logistical kind of like frameworks that we try and use to kind of stimulate questions and kind of framing around projects? I'll share that link as well. And then also, it's not just data, software, the artifacts. There's a community and kind of experts that need to be shared as well, because otherwise it's a small elite high priesthood of experts who just kind of get recycled in project after project. So we need to be building ecosystems. We need to be sharing and connecting those ecosystems so that there's South-South collaboration or whatever it is that you want to call it. And that's kind of, we start breaking down these barriers that kind of, expertise create in themselves.
Yeah, sorry, really interesting what Justin just said about also like creating these ecosystems within the communities. And I think that's also really interesting and connects with what Roxana was saying and the work of EMAF about not only using, software and drones and mobile applications, but also engaging with what we can call humble data, right? Like paper trails, going the archives, speaking with the community. So it's this ecosystem of digital data, software, codes, but also the importance of, and I say again, with quote unquote humble data, low-tech data and information and technologies.
Thank you, Aurelie. Last chance for questions. I would like to have one. for the people of X sites, if you don't mind, which is the creation of categories. I don't know if you can unpack that a little bit more, because I think that's very important to come up with categories that are not created by, these experts, but the people. And what does that involve?
Yeah, it's a good question, because categories are reflecting the way we represent our epistemology, our ontology. And so we are trying to capture, right, this ontology from this grounded ontology from indigenous people, for example. It's very interesting to note that they will when they say we want to map the forest, they will never separate the natural data from the social data, because in their understanding there is no meaning of doing that. So of course we are limited in the way we can represent these categories, because it's based on decision trees, but people can choose the category and the way they organize them. So
and illustrate them.
Yeah, so the designer, they choose the category they want to represent. So it's still very limited.
Can you give examples, like particular examples, because I think that'll be key of the kind of categories.
Yeah, for example, they would start to. It's very funny in Cameroon. They have started to. They say, hey, we want to map the forest spirit, as a way to reflect the understanding of the forest. So it means that there is the sacred place, but also when there is all of this ceremony and these rituals, they will map that. So they will not only take a pictures, icon, and record it. So it's very interesting to note that the way they ask us to organize these categories will also change our minds, because we'll start seeing the forest from their eyes. Okay, and this is where it's truly becoming interesting.
And a lot also of what we mean by categories, it's not necessarily the way that things are organized. So when we would categorize something in Britain, for example, we might have something that we understand as a participating in a category. So like an orange is a kind of fruit, for example. A lot of the way that things then end up being organized, for example, in Fabian's project or some of the other projects that we have, for example, in Brazil, the categories that we would anticipate aren't the categories that people use to organize the kind of data that they collect. So it's a really good question, Irving. I don't think we could ever possibly explain it in enough detail or give it enough merit, but it's really interesting to understand the way that people organize how they experience the natural world. And that's one of the things that we learn a lot doing these kind of projects.
Thank you very much, both. And I think, yes, I agree with you that it would be just impossible to do it in just a few minutes, right? So if they want to stay in touch with you, right, please
do get in touch with us.
Exactly. Journalists, NGOs, or academics, right? So I just want to finish just by thank you all, right? The participants, but also the attendees.